Hello, students. I just wanted to take a couple minutes here and add a couple things to your knowledge about colonial New England. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is kind of where New England is. So this is what modern day New England looks like. You can see here we've got the state of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut down here. In colonial times, we had Plymouth, which becomes part of Massachusetts eventually. It is, remember, we've talked about how the Mayflower came in 1620. Massachusetts colony is started in 1630. That's here. Massachusetts colony also includes Maine at this time. We have Rhode Island colony, which is started in 1636, Connecticut colony, which is started in 1336, sorry, and New Hampshire colony, which is started in 1638. And we'll talk a little bit about how those got started and why they got started in a later slide. One big thing that is going to impact New England forever and the rest of the United States as well is this concept of the New England village. So in New England, families came over and they settled together in villages. And these villages all had sort of a similar pattern. In the middle of the village, they had a village green area right here. Then they would have a church and sometimes a town hall, sometimes a school, depending on how big the village or town was. And the whole community was centered around this sort of central area. So this is a map of what that sort of looks like. So here we have the village green in the middle, we have our church, our town hall. Next to the church, we have our graveyard, we have our school over here. And then outside of this sort of center area is where our villages are living. And then we have our farms out here even further. So what would happen is you would live in one of these cities, one of these small houses, and then you would walk out to where your farm was every day, and that's where you would do your work, and then you would come home to the village. And because all of these homes are so close together, the villagers are sort of living in each other's pockets. They're very aware of what's going on in other people's homes, kind of who gets along with who and who doesn't get along with who. And so they're all very tight knit. And we can see how this sort of can create positive things and negative things. So on the one hand, it means that they're very protected from attacks because they're all close together. But on the other hand, it means that there's also a lot of gossip, and we can see how the damage that could do when we talked about the Salem witch trials just a couple days ago. So what would happen is these families would have kids, and the first couple kids would be able to build a home in the village, and then they would get some farmland outside, but eventually they would run out of space. And so what would happen is then a group of these villagers or these village children that are now adults, like young adults, would move out away, usually about 10 miles, and they would start a new village. And then the same pattern was sort of repeated over and over and over again. But as they would move out, they were moving into land that was Native American land. And at the beginning, in the early 1600s, there is the Native Americans in the area are having these ongoing epidemics, and thousands of people are dying because of smallpox. But as the 1600s ends, the Native Americans have mostly become resilient to many of the diseases they're bringing. So their population starts to bounce back. And the pressure of the populations growing, both the New Englanders growing and the Native Americans population growing, are going to cause a lot of conflicts. So one of the problems with this was these cow pastures. So when New Englanders looked for farms, they were looking for areas that were plowed with nice, neat, straight rows. They were looking for areas that were sort of fenced off, protected from the animals. That is not how Native Americans farmed. Native Americans practiced Three Sisters farming, which we've talked about, where you kind of grow your corn and your beans and your squash together, and those three plants sort of help each other. And so what would happen is the New Englanders would let their cattle and their sheep and their pigs loose in the forests or in the woodlands around, and those animals would eat and destroy the Native American farmland, which obviously was very frustrating for the Native Americans and was something they really, really disliked. In addition, the New Englanders didn't always ask before farming or creating villages, and so this would also cause conflict with Native Americans in the region. So this is an example of what your notes from the first section could look like. Now, I don't want you to copy this exactly. I want you to have your own ideas, but this is just sort of a review to make sure that you got all the stuff. So if I were you, I would pause it right now and check this with my stuff and then jump back in a minute. So um, some kind of big things we should remember is that Puritans want to create England 2.0, right? They want to make an England that is even better than England, and so that eventually the English people will be like, "Oh, Puritans, you're so right. We should be totally living like you." So they are not interested in intermarriage with Native Americans or mixing it all, and they're going to create a very separate society. The other thing we should know about New England is it's got rocky soil and it's cold. They have warm summers, but really cold winters. And then we should probably talk a little bit about how Puritans are very, very strict. There's like no Christmas, um, no real holidays. Like you go to church for 7 hours on Sunday. It's very, very strict. There are three conflicts during this colonial period we should talk about. The first is religious conflict, and then we'll talk about some conflicts with Native Americans. And the third is international conflicts. So in 1630, Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up, and in 1636, so just 6 years after, they start having issues. So the people who disagreed with what was going on with the leaders often ended up getting kicked out and exiled because the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony like could not handle anybody believing anything different. So I wanted to talk about two of these sort of dissonances. Sorry. The first I wanted to talk about was Anne Hutchinson. So this is a picture of her. She believed that women should be able to preach just like men. She had some really interesting ideas about the way salvation was gained and how people should live their lives. And the leaders of the colony did not like that. And so she was actually excommunicated, which means she was cut out of the church and she was exiled. She was kicked out of the colony. This is Roger Williams. Roger Williams had similar ideas. He also believed that they should be paying the Native Americans for the land that they were taking from them. And the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony didn't really like him because of that. And so they also exiled him. So Roger Williams goes on to create a colony called Rhode Island. And Hutchinson and several other descendants go and live with him there. And they create a community that is has total religious freedom. So they get some Quakers that come there to come find peace and some other groups as well. And Hutchinson, though, eventually leaves Rhode Island because she's still worried about the Massachusetts Bay leaders, like really, really didn't like her. She was worried about her life and her children's lives. And so she moves to New Amsterdam, where she lives for the rest of her life. There were also conflicts with Native Americans at this time. Oh, sorry, before we talk about conflicts with Native Americans, let's go back. There were several other people who also set up colonies around the 1636, 1638 period. Those colonies become Connecticut and New Hampshire, but it's the same deal. These people are speaking out against what they believe is wrong in the way they're practicing the church, and then because church and state are the same thing, they get booted out of the colony and they have to go start over. So conflicts with Native Americans. There is ongoing conflict with Native Americans at this time. We have this one like bright moment, right, when Squanto helps the Pilgrims in the very beginning, and Massasoit comes to this Thanksgiving dinner, and it's like this one moment of peace, and then everything goes downhill from there. So in previous lessons, we've talked about how the Native Americans and the English had very different views about what success meant and what families meant and what farming looked like. And those kind of come to a head in two wars. So the first war I wanted to talk about was the Pequot War, and the Pequots were a group of Native Americans who were living in what today is Connecticut, and they got sort of caught in this conflict between three different groups of people. So we have the New England settlers, we have the Dutch, and we have the French. And the New England settlers ally with some local Native American tribes to kill the Pequots. And so this is the first time these Native American tribes have really experienced European style warfare, which is basically, we will kill you until you are all dead. And there's lots of accounts here about how the Native Americans are like, whoa, 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 whoa. This is not what we meant to happen. But the end result is that the Pequot nation is destroyed. The survivors are shipped off as slaves to the West Indies, or they're assimilated into other tribes, and they sort of totally disappear. And the New Englanders steal their land. So the New Englanders would start fights with Native Americans so that then they could be justified in killing the Native Americans and stealing their lands. This happens over and over and over throughout the 16 and 1700s. But it kind of comes to a head with what is called King Philip's War. So Metacom was called King Philip by the English because the English are really good at pronouncing Native American names. Metacom was Massasoit's son, and he realizes that the English are going to take all of the land, and so he and his people unite in a big alliance, and they start burning towns. They would come to these villages and they would burn them, and they ended up actually attacking something like 60% of the towns at the time, before the English are finally able to retaliate, and they get some extra help from England and fight and then kill King Philip and all of his people as well. So there's conflict with the Native Americans, and it ends with Native Americans losing land is the result of these conflicts. There were also international conflicts. So this is a picture of how the English took New Amsterdam. Basically, they sailed up with 3 warships and were like, we want this. And the people of New Amsterdam were like, we're not soldiers, so you can have it. So the whole New England region was kind of a pawn in these big fights between the Dutch and the English and the Spanish and the French. And these kings in Europe didn't really care what was happening to the people in the Americas. They were more concerned about how much money they could get from them. And so they were looking for furs to trade, also any resources like gold or any minerals they could find, and the access to the woodlands to make ships. So what happens is there is a lot of small scale fights that are sort of backed by these English kings. So whether we're talking about the French giving guns to Native American tribes so the Native American tribes can raid English villages, or English people raiding Dutch settlements and being like, oh, we totally thought that you were Native American, you were not our allies. This sort of international conflict is going to be played out on a small scale in the colonies as well. So this is kind of a timeline of things you should know. So we have 1620, Mayflower lands, 1630 is Massachusetts, 1636 is religious conflict goes crazy. Also in 1636, Harvard University is put together. So this just shows how fast they're growing. Like they have been there for 6 to 8 years and they're already putting together a university. In 1637, we have the Pequot War, where they're all killed. In 1675, we have Metacom's War. And then in 1692, we have the Salem witch trial. So this is all happening in the 1600s. These are some people you should know about. So to turn in for this assignment is you need to pick either an event, so one of the events we talked about, or one of these people, and you need to identify and describe them. So you're going to kind of give me one sentence telling me who they are, and then another sentence kind of giving me a little more depth about them, and then a third sentence telling me why they're important. So you could talk about Squanto and how he taught the Pilgrims how to farm and fish in New England. You could talk about Massasoit and how he was the first chieftain to make treaties with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. You could talk about Roger Williams and how he was kicked out because he didn't believe the same things and he started a new colony. You could talk about Cotton Mather, who was that famous preacher that we talked about when we talked about the Salem witch trials, who was very influential in the things he believed. You could talk about Anne Hutchinson and her getting kicked out and moving away. Thomas Hooker was the guy who came up with Connecticut. With him, he got kicked out because he didn't believe what everyone else believed. You could talk about John Winthrop, who was the governor, or you could talk about Metacom, who is King Philip. Or if you know somebody else from this time period, you can talk about them too. So I have given you some information. You probably should look this person up on Wikipedia, do a little Google research, but I wouldn't expect this to take more than 10 minutes. So this whole assignment you should be done with in 45 minutes. If you go longer than 45 minutes, then you should just stop, email me and say, this is all I could get done, and we'll come up with a plan together. So good luck, and I'll see you later.